Well, hello everyone, welcome to my first ever whiteboard walkthrough where we're going to be discussing the basic fundamental information that I discussed in my previous videos in a little bit more detail. I'm going to use an example for that. The example I have given here is the handbrake turn with a difference. There's a good reason for that. Normally we would teach a driver a handbrake turn as a technique in order for them to get round a fairly tight corner. Here we're going to use the handbrake turn in a different way as a training aid in order to pull out the relevant information that the driver should be paying attention to. And it's a great technique for doing that. The reason being is that everything happens at a reasonably low speed, and at lower speed it's easier for you to take in and digest new information. So what I'm going to do first is run through for the benefit of those who have never done a handbrake turn in a rear wheel drive car, to give them an idea of how it works in very simplistic form, and then we're going to run through the process again, paying particular attention to the information that the handbrake turn can teach you. So let's see how that works out. So for the benefit of those who have never been through a handbrake turn in a rear-wheel drive car in the past, we're going to run through that with a very basic theme now. So you'll see behind me there's a little box there, in fact says basics. Within that there are 4 items. So the first one, speed or energy. Is very important that you carry enough speed or energy into that particular turn in order to get the car to change direction with the use of the handbrake. If you don't, the car won't slide. If you use too much, perhaps the car will slide a little bit too far and give you a bit of a scare. Okay, that's not scary at all, it's actually quite good fun. You'll see there as well, we've obviously got the clutch, the steering and the handbrake as well that you're going to use in a very particular manner in order to make this happen. So looking behind me then, you'll see there's a little diagram with a very simplistic drawn car pointing at what I've drawn out here as a cone. Okay, so you're going to keep the car straight and stable on the approach. The reason for that, and the reason I say straight and stable, what I mean by that in fact, is no steering inputs whatsoever right up to the point where you want to change direction, so you're not influencing the car laterally. And when you're building up and holding your speed, you then give the car a stable linear approach as well. So you're not adding or removing power away, giving a linear weight transfer just before you get to the point where you want to change direction. Everything here is set up in such a way you want to keep the car very neutral on the approach. So you're purely carrying in a set amount of energy with a very level set out car. So you're not turning and you're not accelerating or decelerating. So when you're on the approach then, dead straight, holding your power right up to the point where you want to change direction. The first dotted line you're going to come to there is just before you get to the cone. You're going to put your foot on the clutch fully to the floor, so you disconnect the drive to the rear wheels so that you don't stall the car when you pull the handbrake out. Fairly straightforward. The next thing you're going to do then is you're going to turn the car in. Okay, so you're going to use a maximum of a half turn on the steering wheel, and that's a usable range that I already know, so I'm helping you with that. Rather than just letting you find out on your own. So this is purely to get you up to speed to get the handbrake turn carried out. So absolute maximum of a half turn on the steering. The reasons for which are, if you exceed a half turn on the steering wheel, usually you'll run into 2 scenarios. Okay, the first scenario would be an understeer. So the amount of resistance that the front wheels are putting against the traveling speed of the car forces the front wheels to lose grip, and then you'll push into what we know as an understeer. So the car will continue straight on, regardless of you having turned the car to the right. The other thing that can happen is if the front wheels are still in grip, the car will turn in at such a fast rate that when you go to pull the handbrake, the spin that you get from that will be at such a high speed you won't be able to recover from it for 2 reasons. One, you've induced a very fast spin in the first place, and the other is the length of time it would take you to get the wheels back is far greater than the car is actually rotating. Okay, so there's 2 reasons for using these very small steering inputs. One is to maximize the use of the grip. You could actually argue there's 3 reasons. Second one is to actually have a control element over the rate of turn, and we'll go into that in more detail later. And the other is the time it takes you to actually undo the steering. Okay, the smaller the steering input, the less time it takes for you to get the steering back straight or to the opposite direction. So very important to consider. So you're going to clutch in, hold your clutch to the floor. When you come into line with the cone, you're going to then think about turning the wheel. Now, you'll see that I've drawn a couple of F's up there. These F's stand for feel, so there's a feel element there, a feedback loop. You're going to ask the car to do something. You're obviously expecting some sort of feedback from that. So as you turn the wheel in, make sure that you feel the car actually start to turn in before you even consider using the handbrake. So use that as your trigger for starting to use the handbrake. So the S I've drawn on there, it means squeeze. Okay, so when you feel the car turn in, you're going to then start progressively squeezing the handbrake. It's very important you do that in a progressive squeeze. You don't just want to pull the handbrake out the floor because you're putting an over input into the handbrake. You don't need to. Okay, all we're trying to do here is simply break traction at the rear of the car, and it doesn't actually require you to lock the back wheels up. It could just be the case of you need to slow the back wheels down in relation to your forward speed a certain amount in order to break traction. So you don't often have to lock the back wheels up. It's just a lot of people do. You just pull it up as hard as you can to get the back wheels to lock. You don't need to do that. Okay, so once you've done your turn in, once you've pulled the handbrake, you're then going to feel the car slide. Again, another feedback moment. We'll go into that in a little bit more detail later because it's a very important part of the turn. That moment where you feel the slide on the handbrake is a great moment to capture some useful information from, but we'll get back to that later. As soon as you feel the car slide then, as soon as you feel the back end of the car come round away from you, you're going to do a few things all at the same time. First one is to drop the handbrake and lift your foot off the clutch. You can do that at exactly the same moment. In fact, it's useful if you do. The next thing you're going to do is add in a certain amount of power to get the car to continue sliding. Okay, for that certain amount of power, it has to be added within a certain time frame. If you leave it too long, the car will start to come into grip again, and then you'll find it really hard to continue the slide. It'll take a lot of work and a lot of effort. Okay, if you put the power in quickly, that means that you can continue the slide fairly smoothly, and it'll take less effort. Okay, so as soon as you drop the handbrake, lift your foot off the clutch, try and squeeze in a little bit of power, just enough to have the back wheels spinning. It's very important that they are spinning, but you don't want them to be spinning too fast. Okay, so you're now controlling the speed of the turn and the duration of the turn by what you do with your feet, with your accelerator more importantly. Okay, you're not steering the car with your hands, you're steering the car with your right foot. The speed of the turn is controlled by how much power you're using. Okay, so if you're using lots of power within a usable range, the car will turn really fast, but you'll find that with the higher wheel spin speed, you'll yes have an increased speed of turn or lateral rotation, but you're actually losing the forward push of the car. So whenever you're using the accelerator, we're trying to balance the forward grip with a minimal amount of rotation, bearing in mind that we want to get around there quickly, but we don't want to lose our forward movement at the same time. So there's a bit of a balance to be struck there. So a nice controlled, balanced amount of wheel spin to continue the turn through is very important. Second thing is the duration. The duration of the turn is controlled by the length of time that you hold the power on for. So if you imagine coming off the power gently before your exit, you're going to exit the corner too soon. If you keep your power on longer than where your exit is, you're going to continue turning much further. So you're actually managing the duration of the turn with your right foot as well. So you'll see as we come through towards the end, I've written in the word there, ease just before you become straight for the exit. The reason for that is as you're easing off the power and the back end of the car is coming back into grip, it's not going to straighten up immediately. There will be a bit of a delay in that, and that's just to take into account that delay. Other important factor there is to make sure your wheels are straight. So regardless of what you've done with your wheels through this particular maneuver, and a lot of people do some really wacky things with the steering as they go through, make sure that your wheels are dead straight in time for you to drive off dead straight in the direction that you're hoping to travel. If your wheels are pointing off to the left or the right in varying degrees, it can influence many things. For one, your exit direction. It can actually cause you to change direction from where you want to go. And it puts a lot of resistance or rolling resistance against the rear wheels trying to push you forward. So if you imagine pushing your car outside, if you've ever pushed the car in the past, this will hopefully make sense to you. If you're pushing the car with dead straight wheels, the car rolls actually quite easily. If you start turning the front wheels, it then starts putting a lot of resistance against your pushing force, and that's exactly what the car will feel here. So if you have dead straight wheels at the point where you're trying to get the car to accelerate away, you'll find that the car doesn't fight against itself, and it'll accelerate away quite smoothly. Okay, so to run through it again very quickly, fairly straightforward. Remember, keep the car straight and stable, holding your power all the way up to the point where you want to change direction. So you get to the first C there where it's put your foot on the clutch just before the cone, and then you're going to think about turning the car in, remembering a half turn max. Okay, so you're going to turn the car in, you're going to feel the car positively turn in, then you're going to squeeze the handbrake until you feel the car slide, then you're going to drop the handbrake, lift your foot off the clutch and add power just enough to get the wheels spinning, and then continue that slide through in a controlled, balanced, held power all the way through until you can see your exit start to ease off, get your grip back. And then once your grip's back and your wheels are straight, you're going to progressively accelerate away and repeat this as many times as it takes for you to be comfortable with it. Now, that's the basics of a handbrake turn. What we're going to do now is run through it all again with a completely different mindset. We're going to look and see at what the handbrake turn can actually teach us in the way of the information it gives us in order to understand the basic fundamentals of car control in a different way. So we've already had a look at the handbrake turn as a technique. We're now going to flip it on its head. We're going to use the handbrake turn with a difference and look at how the handbrake turn can actually teach us things about the fundamentals of car control. Okay, so I've swapped out one of the boxes behind for what was the basics box is now going to be an information box. We're going to look at taking in information, very specific information at very particular times and points throughout the technique to understand things like effort, timing, the speed of the input, correction factors that you're putting in, and usable ranges. Very, very important information. Okay, you also see underneath that box that's been there the whole time, I think, where I've said about the setup of the car and the environment around you. Now, where possible, you want to try and keep everything constant. Okay, so for the car and the environment around you, you want everything to stay the same throughout the training exercise so that you're not adding in other variables which would then perhaps give false feedback. Okay, it's very important that when you're running through this that you're able to get to a point where you can repeat things and that you understand you're able to repeat those things because certain things remain the same. That's very, very important. So with the car, if you have an adjustable setup on the car, try and have everything mid-set so you're not running on the stickiest tires or the loosest tires that you have. Try and have like a medium set. Same with suspension, brake bias, so on and so forth. If you haven't got an adjustable car, don't worry about it. Just make sure that you are running on fairly even tires, the pressures are the same, so that if you were to add a stickier tire or perhaps a looser tire onto the car, you'll be able to feel and experience a difference there and understand whether it's having a positive or a negative influence. So for the environment around you, try and keep the grip, if you can, fairly medium grip. You don't want to be running on the stickiest tarmac, and you certainly don't want to be out in a grassy field or out in snow or ice for this. You want to be sort of mid-set grip level. You also want to be flat, so no cambers, no gradients, again, no other outside influences that would upset the feedback that you're getting from the car. We can add those in at a later date, but here we're trying to set a benchmark. We're trying to set a midpoint for you to start from so that you have a better understanding of things. So ultimately what we're trying to achieve here is a basic input to what I'm about to describe is a feedback loop system so that you're taking in the relevant information that allows you then to understand and set things like the timing of things, your usable ranges, so on and so forth. But that is done through a repetitive cycle, and that's why everything here has to remain fairly constant so that you can pull out the changes, you can understand and adjust things in such a way that it makes perfect sense to you. And the more accurate your system is, the more efficient your driving is going to be. So we're going to start off by having at the very early stages purely a visual input. So if you've never done this before, you're going to look out ahead of you and you're going to see a certain maneuver to carry out. Okay, but once you've been through it a few times, you'll start adding prior knowledge into that, which is really useful. So you're going to have that visual cue to carry out particular input. You're then going to put into the car a measured input, obviously, to get the car to change direction, and with that then perhaps with your prior knowledge a correction factor, either adding or taking something away, and that could be anything. That could be the timing, it could be was it somewhere out of range, is it the speed of your input. It doesn't really matter. Okay, all of those things you're taking into account each time you go through this process, but it helps if you focus on one at a time. So when you're going through for the first little bit, I recommend finding the ranges first. That would make sense, and then try and work on things like the timing of the input, how fast the input needs to be, so on and so forth. Okay, so when you get your measured input put into the car, you're obviously then looking back at where the F's are on the board. You're looking at getting some sort of feel feedback response. So visually and through feel, you'll have an understanding of whether that input was correct. Did it give you too much or too little? And then you may have a correction to go back into the next process. So as you go back to the start, you may carry a correction with you that will be used later on, or in fact you may have hit the nail on the head and go back through to the process, start again. And if you can repeat that several times without having to add a correction factor in, I would say you're getting pretty much bob on. Okay, but there is a system to understand how much is too much or too little, and that's what we're going to run through now. Okay, so earlier on, I've drawn up a couple of little diagrams to give you an idea of what I mean by these ranges and the things that we're interested in. So looking at the one that's highlighted here as energy first, you'll see that the sweet spot we're looking for is in the green, okay? Bearing in mind that we're sticking to a similar surface and we're repeating the same exercise over and over again. This is going to be fairly linear. But as you change things like cambers or surface type, tire wear, so on and so forth, this can change. But you need to know where to start from first. Hence the reason I've given you a mid-start point. Looking at the setup of the car and the environment around you. If you know that baseline, then if anything changes from the surface type, the conditions, wet or dry, so on and so forth, you'll have an understanding of how that influences the energy on the approach. The energy on the approach is governed by how you know something else is going to work in the future. So this is really hard to get straight away. What you're looking at doing now is finding constants. Okay, so when you're thinking about setting your energy, you need to plan ahead and think, right, I need to set some other things the same each time I go around. So I would recommend setting the steering exactly the same and setting the handbrake exactly the same until you get an understanding of how to adjust the energy on the approach. So you're going to alter the energy, but you're going to keep other things exactly the same. So the steering input and the handbrake use would be identical as best you can each time you go round. Okay. So for setting the absolute maximum and minimum ranges of your energy on the approach, your lower end, you're going to be looking at will the technique actually work? Okay, so it's the point where the car will actually start to slide at the lower end is where you're interested in. Bearing in mind, you have to take into account the information about the environment around you. It's on that surface, on a flat surface, with the car set up in a very particular way. And then you need to attach that to this particular piece of information. So the very bottom end of the scale where the car is going to start working for you is where the car will start to slide, and that's at a very particular speed. The same at the other end. Yes, you could argue that once you've got past that point that the car is going to slide for you. Of course it is. The bit we're interested in at the absolute maximum at the other end is, can you actually control and continue the slide without losing control of the car? Okay, so that would be the absolute maximum upper limit. Okay, beyond that then, it's fine tuning. You'll be able to tell, was it too much or too little in relation to how much input on the steering and the handbrake you need to use later on. So ultimately what we're trying to do here is find a sweet spot on the energy on the approach that allows you to run in the green elements of the throttle, the steering and the handbrake later on. Okay, and there's another way that we can look into that as we run through. So first thing you're going to do is you're going to repeat this cycle of keeping the handbrake input and the steering input exactly the same, and then find out where a sweet spot is in the energy on the approach. Okay, it will change later on, because as you find a sweet spot here, you can then start looking at adjusting things like your steering input. You have to adjust your steering input anyway because of the higher energy you carry in, the less steering you need to use, so on and so forth. But you won't appreciate the change if you start adjusting the steering at the same time. So it's very important that we do that. So you'll find that as you run through this, looking at each thing individually, it all starts to make sense and come together in a very, very cool way. Okay, so that's the first thing we're going to look at, is your energy. The next thing then would be ignoring the clutch. So we're going to keep the clutch exactly the same as what we had it through the basic lesson. So clutch to the floor, you're going to start looking at your turn. So say you found your sweet spot on your energy, you've got a good idea of where that is and it's repeatable. You can find that. Okay, so it's going to be considerably higher speed than what you would have perhaps started out at. Usually that's the case. You tend to go into things a little bit more reserved, and then you would build up your speed until you get to the point where you're happy. So just say it's a slightly higher speed than what you were using before. You may find that that half turn maximum that we used on the steering before is now too much for several reasons. I think we discussed those earlier. You may find that one is that the car might start to understeer. If you're carrying in more energy and you're putting in a steering input, bear in mind you're traveling faster, the steering input now has to go in at a higher speed. Speed of input, very, very important, okay? So you're now traveling at a faster speed, your input on the steering now has to be quicker, but there's a saving grace here. It also can be a lot smaller. You don't need as large a steering input to get the car to rotate at your desired speed, okay? So now, with that energy held in the green, you're now going to try and focus on getting the steering into the green as well. And how you would do that is by utilizing the energy being the same and the handbrake being the same. So you're isolating things one at a time. So initially we're isolating the energy by keeping the steering and the handbrake the same. And now you're going to look at isolating the steering by keeping your energy the same and your use of the handbrake the same. Okay, so initially, again, you'll find that the half turn is too big. You'll start to dial that steering away, and then lo and behold, you'll find that somewhere between, say, 0 and 90 degrees, sometimes, as small as an eighth of a turn is more than enough to get the car to change direction. But it's understanding where those ranges are. So setting those maximum ranges on the steering again, when you've got an understanding of how much energy to carry in, you now need to set your maximum and minimums for the steering. Okay, so you need to understand how little the steering input you can start to get the car to turn in, and what is too much at the other end. So where are you starting to get understeer, for example? And then once you have that set usable range and you know where it is, you know not to go there. So you'll start to have a relationship with this surface, with that particular car setup behind, on that particular day, with no gradients or anything else. that you'll understand that that is the maximum amount of steering that you can get away with using, or you'll know roughly where that ballpark is, and that's extremely useful to know, okay? So already you can start to see we're painting a very useful fundamental basics understanding of how and why things are happening in a particular way. So you know how to set the energy, you know how to set how much steering there is. Now we need to look at how much effort to use on the handbrake. So let's just say, for the sake of it, we've got the handbrake, the effort we've been using is too high. The reason I get you to use the handbrake in the manner of a squeeze is because you don't need to lock the back wheels up. I probably explained that earlier. All you're trying to do is change the speed of rotation on the back wheels enough within a certain time frame so that it breaks traction whilst the car is turning. If you turn the car in the way that I've described earlier, with a deliberate pause between the turn and the pull of the handbrake, the simple rotation element of the car turning in actually assists the brake of traction at the rear of the car, okay, for a number of reasons. As you turn the wheel in, it creates a resistance on the front wheels. The front wheels start to slow the car down. So if you're traveling in at a higher speed and then you turn the wheels in, you do get a gentle weight transfer purely from the steering alone. And then as the car starts to lean on the outside, you need the gentlest of touch on the handbrake to get the car to break free. Now, if you over input on the handbrake, again, we're looking at the timing, and in fact, timing can mean a couple of things. Timing is actually when you do it, and the time taken to carry the maneuver out. Okay, so when you're looking at steering, if you're putting lots of steering in, that takes a lot of time, and it also takes a lot of time to get steering back out. Same for the handbrake. If you're using the handbrake for a longer period of time than you need to, it's taking your attention away from other things that you should be doing at that particular moment in time. So the less you can be on the handbrake, the better. So what we're looking at here is a very progressive squeeze on the handbrake until you feel the car start to slide. There are other influences. So changing the energy on the approach, changing the steering input on the approach will also alter how much effort you need on the handbrake. Okay, so they all work hand in hand. You need to isolate them one at a time to understand how those things influence each other. Okay, it's very, very important. So you'll see that it's fairly straightforward now how to set out those ranges and how to fine-tune them. How to understand whether you've used too much or too little steering is through the efficiency of the turn. Okay, it's probably something I should have written on the board behind. The efficiency is how long did it take and how much distance did you cover, for example, to get from point A to point B. Okay, you'll find that it's noticeably better as you add or remove certain components. Okay, so what you should be paying attention to as well as we go through is the efficiency of the output that you're actually trying to achieve. So as you're coming in with a certain amount of energy, using a certain amount of steering and a certain amount of effort on the handbrake, you should be able to measure in some way, be it through your own experience or by timing it or by videoing it, doesn't really matter. Did it take less or more time to get through that particular turn? Another way of measuring this is effort. Okay, did it take less or more effort? If it's taking less effort, that's a great place to start. You'll probably find that what is taking less effort is actually taking less time as well. And that's not just effort from you, that's effort from the car. It may take very little effort from you, but are you having to work the throttle quite hard to get the car to where you want it to be? So minimal effort here is what we're looking for, and that's really efficient. Okay, so same with the throttle then. So once you've initiated that slide, once you've got the power on and you're continuing the turn, we're looking at, obviously from the point where you clutch off and power on, and you're adding in potentially correction factors. Okay, so initially you need to know, again, set your ranges. Your usable range is going to be, say, somewhere at the tail end of the orange there. So if we say that's your usable range, you also need to know where the limits are, so either side of that usable range. So it's really good to go into that turn. You do your handbrake turn once you've got everything else squared out. You're going to do your clutch, your turn, your pull, you're going to add your power in, but add too little, and then try and find the sweet spot where the turn actually starts to work. Okay, so that's your absolute bottom end of the range. Then at the other end of the scale, try and find out where the point is where it is too much, and you'll find that it's actually, I've drawn this really big, it could only be the case of like 3 or 4 degrees of depression on the accelerator is the difference between maximum and minimum, depending on how powerful your car is and how slippy that particular surface is. Okay, so once you've got your usable range in there, Finding your sweet spot again comes down to effort and efficiency, okay? And all of these things work hand in hand again. If you get your energy on the approach correct, your steering correct, and the effort on the handbrake correct, you'll have to do very little work with the throttle to continue the turn, which makes finding the exit and everything else all that little bit easier, okay? The other thing you'll notice here, if I get rid of this now, I haven't mentioned countersteer at all, okay? And it's very important that we leave that out of this process. So from the moment you start the slide, from the moment you pull the handbrake, all the way through to your exit point here, no countersteer. Leave the countersteer out of the equation, okay? The reason for that is, I want you to be able to understand how to accurately control the car, the duration and the speed of the turn, purely by using your throttle. You do not need countersteer for this particular test, for this particular maneuver, whilst you're learning these systems and processes. And if you have countersteer in there, it kind of fudges your responses, it fudges your answers, because every single time you go round a turn in a rear-wheel drive car, you're going to naturally want to countersteer, where in this particular scenario, you don't need to. If you're going through a long sweeping turn, yes, you do need to, otherwise you'd spin out. But here, you're not going through a long sweeping turn, you're turning around a single point rotation, and you can actually get rid of the countersteer altogether or use very, very little of it. The less countersteer you use here at this particular moment in time whilst you're learning these things, the better understanding you will have of how much power to use on the accelerator. So once you've been through this process a number of times and you start to understand and be able to register how much effort you're putting in, what that actually means in the way of how much work the car is doing, you can actually play around again, not just with the amount of energy or the amount of input you're putting in on the steering, you can actually play around with the timing of things as well. Am I doing things too early or too late? A great example of that is in the use of the steering on the approach. I'll just give you a quick run through. If you were to imagine you've set the energy on the approach correct, you understand how much effort to put in on the handbrake, so on and so forth, you'll find that the higher the entry speed that you carry in, the earlier you can get away in the timing wise of putting the steering in, because the car will drift ever so slightly laterally as you rotate around that particular cone. As you find the sweet spot and the energy on the approach, you have to alter other things such as timing and the amount of effort you're putting in on the steering in order to get it to work well for you. Everything works hand in hand, but like I said before, focus on one thing at a time. Try and get used to the ranges, try and set your ranges first so that you understand what is too much, what is too little, and then try and narrow that range down into a sweet spot, somewhere into the orange, and if you can, get it into the green, and repeat it so that you're comfortable with it, you're confident with it. And then you'll find that things will work really well for you. Then focus on things like the timing. And then once you've got the timing, work on, for example, how much effort am I using? If you're comfortable with that amount of effort, when things start to go wrong or they're not working for you, you'll feel and appreciate the change in how much effort you're using. You may even understand that there's something mechanically wrong with the car, so on and so forth. Same for your speed of input. Again, steering's a great example of that. As you increase your speed on the approach, the amount of time you actually have to initiate that change in direction shrinks significantly, and then the speed of input changes, and how that speed of input then can influence things like losing grip at the front of the car and so on. So everything works hand in hand, but you can only figure those things out by isolating them one at a time. So being able to break something like handbrake turn down, and again, I love this technique because it's low speed, everything happens at a fairly manageable rate, and it's easy for you to take in and absorb. If you're going out with the purpose of getting seat time and deliberately practicing something, this is brilliant. From a rally perspective, this is great to work with. But the same principles work in any motorsport for any technique or any circuit. It's a case of going out and isolating things that you know that you need to change in order to understand what is your usable range, what are the timings, how much effort should I be feeling, so on and so forth. And if you can break those things down and take them home with you, you're setting yourself up for a great time out in the car. Okay, you're rather than just going out and doing lap after lap or stage after stage, just repeating the same things that you did before. Every time you should go out in the car, it should be to develop yourself and progress yourself that little bit further. Nobody's perfect, and I think this is a great way of understanding that, being able to adapt yourself to the changes in car, changes in the environment. More so here, whereas drawn up, if you've got to the point where you're happy and comfortable with everything else here, in that neutral setting, you can start mixing it up. You could change the setup of the car, your tires, alter the compound between the front and the rear, and then swap them round and see what the differences are. And that's really useful for when perhaps something goes wrong with the car. Perhaps you get like a slow puncture, and you'll start to be able to feel those things change. Same with suspension setup. Try and go in softer on the front, harder on the back, and then vice versa. Once you understand and you've repeat this enough, you'll start to see whether it's having a positive or a negative. Is it helping you, or is it making you work harder? Those are the things to pay attention to. Same with the brake bias. Okay, you'll notice as well that I didn't mention the brakes in here earlier. The good reason for that is because it throws in another external source of energy. Where you could start mixing it up again, that's something else I could have added to this list from the vehicle side, is by having a higher speed approach into this particular turn, to the point where you need to start adding the brakes in. Now you have to remember that as you're coming in at higher speed and then you start adding the brakes in, you will get a weight transfer, so there'll be more weight over the front wheels, which will affect how much steering you can use. And then that combination of the weight transfer and the turn just before you use the handbrake will also influence how much effort you need to use the handbrake, if you need to use it at all. There may be enough energy there between the energy that you've used during the braking and the steering input to initiate the turn in that you would have used the handbrake for in the first place. Other thing to bear in mind there with the use of the brakes and the handbrake, it's very important that you don't use them combined at the same time. If you're on the foot brake and then use the handbrake and then come off the foot brake, it can quite often lock the handbrake on. Okay, it has happened to myself many times in my early days, where I didn't understand the mechanics of the car. But yeah, if you find that you've actually got into a corner, you've put your foot on the brake and then somehow used the handbrake at the same time without realizing it, when you get to the exit of the turn and you're trying to put the power down, you feel the car is still slowing down, it'll be bogging up against you. And the reason for that is that you've locked the handbrake on, and then usually a quick couple of pumps on the handbrake will release it. Okay, but bear that in mind. It does have an external influence on the energy that you need from the handbrake and the steering on the approach, because you're adding in a weight transfer just before you get to the point where you want to change direction. So as well as playing around with the setup of the car, changing the tires around, suspension set and the brake bias, so on, you can also play around with the environment. Try and find somewhere that offers you things like slope. Approach the same technique as we have here, if you can, on the same surface, and then purely alter whether you're going uphill or downhill. If you have that facility, that's brilliant. It's really useful to know, because adding the influence of gravity going uphill and downhill really is a useful thing to know. So the easiest way of looking at this is, if you're going uphill, treat it as you're going into a higher grip surface, because gravity is fighting against you, it's pushing you harder into the ground, and you'll find that everything takes more effort and more work. Whereas if you're going downhill, gravity is assisting you, and it's almost like driving on a surface that offers less grip. So those things are really worth looking into and adapting into your driving style, and knowing by looking ahead visually through repetition, you'll be able to say, well, I need to alter my driving in a certain way to make that particular maneuver work on that slope. Same for cambers and changes in surface. Now, for cambers, again, obviously if you have a hill, you can then set the handbrake turn on a positive or a negative camber, just to see how the initial input onto that turn as it sweeps through will change, and you'll need to adapt your approach to those particular things as well. If you're doing a handbrake turn into a negative camber, obviously there's going to be a lot of assistance from gravity, and if you're doing it again uphill, you're going to be fighting against gravity as you go through, so more effort would be required on the way through, and with the steering and the amount of power you use, so on and so forth. Changes in surface are usually pretty straightforward to do. If you've got a gravel surface, you could then perhaps keep one end dry, and if you have enough room to run two cones a set distance apart, you could also look at perhaps having one wet and the other one dry, which would be really useful. And because you're dealing with those in close time, you can actually see very quickly the difference in effort required to achieve the sweet spot, those green ranges in each of your inputs. Well, I think that's enough for now. There's quite a lot of information to run through there. Okay, I probably have skipped over some things. It's a lot to run through. Normally this information I run through with the driver in a car. I would give a very simplistic overview on the whiteboard to give the driver an understanding of what we're about to do. But then once we're in the car, I would then add more information in when it was relevant, at the time it was relevant, as the driver is progressing through various stages of this. So you can do also a check of understanding at those particular moments in time. So as we're running through, I would then, observe the driver setting their ranges so that they understand where is too much and too little. I can see that they understand that, then you'd move on to something else, so on and so forth. So it's not really something that I would normally deliver on a whiteboard, but hopefully this has come across fairly straightforward, and it gives you a good understanding as to how much more information you can actually be pulling out of even the most basic of techniques, such as a handbrake turn. Sometimes it gets forgotten about and left, for that moment where you might need it on a stage. But actually, if you have time and you have space to get out there and practice things like this, obviously you need to change things up ever so slightly if your drivetrain is different, be it a front-wheel drive or a four-wheel drive. But the basis of pulling the information out from the technique is fairly similar, and I could certainly help you with that. Well, hopefully that's been a refreshing change from all of the videos I've done stuck in the back of my Range Rover, albeit that's the only place at home where I can get any peace and quiet away from the animals and the kids. Okay, I hope it's been a useful insight into what I meant by the fundamentals, the basics, and how to pull those out of something as simple as a handbrake turn. Sometimes, even the most simple things in motorsport are overlooked and completely walked past purely because you can't see the information that's right in front of you. So hopefully that's given, this has given an insight into that and the things that you can actually go out there and look for. Just bear in mind that when you're going out to get seat time, it's more beneficial to you to have something to go out there and improve, and knowing how to improve those things are things that coaching really helps with. It helps you by giving you the tools in order to understand when you're going out the things to pay attention to look for, and how to see whether you're improving within yourself or not. So this is a very simplistic way of putting that across. I'm used to delivering things like this in car, so normally I would give a very simplistic overview on the whiteboard of what we're trying to achieve, and then add more and more information actually in the car to the driver directly at the moment where it is most beneficial to them. So doing this on the board in such great detail is not usually something I'm accustomed to. It's usually saved for inside of the car at the moment where I feel that it's most beneficial to the driver. So this is great for me. It's stretching the grey matter, and it's looking at a completely new way of getting that information across. So I don't have a problem doing it, and thanks very much for watching the video. What I do look forward to though is your feedback and any suggestions that you might have for having the videos perhaps improve. So obviously sound is one of them. In here it does sound a bit like a cathedral. I can only apologize for that, but there are other areas that I can use within this building that perhaps are a little bit better in the future. And yeah, general delivery, what sort of diagrams you want to see, what sort of information you want coming across. So idea for content for new videos would be greatly received. I think this has been great for me. It's great for boosting my confidence. I'm a lot more relaxed in front of the camera than what I used to, so I'm developing new skills as I go as well. And I've got you guys to thank for that. You've kept me going. So until next time, I look forward to feedback and all of your ideas, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks very much.